Central Asia, the birthplace of Borat, systematic corruption, and the region Russia likes to bully the most. It's pretty safe to say Central Asia isn't an economic powerhouse, and in fact I'm 90% certain you can't even name the 5 nations comprising it. Many issues such as being landlocked, having incompetent governments that prefer building cities made of marble instead of feeding their own people, and the fact every major empire in the region has invaded them due to their strategic location are just some of the reasons living in Central Asia is actually not very nice. But the weird thing is that Central Asia should be one of the richest regions on the planet. They have a rapidly growing population, a virtually unlimited amount of natural resources, and good relationships with both Russia, China, and the West. Even though Borat depicted Kazakhstan and Central Asia in general as a perfect utopia with highly sophisticated technologies and immense wealth, unfortunately, reality is much more disappointing. The most obvious issue is geography. Half the region is filled with unbearably hot deserts, and the other half with uninhabitable mountain ranges, which means only a small percentage of the total land can sustain large populations. And also water is a very scarce resource in the region, though luckily they have copious amounts of vodka to deal with this problem. And lastly, they are obviously landlocked, which makes international trade much more expensive. But an even more important issue is obviously corruption. While the people of Central Asia battle starvation on a daily basis, their leaders seem occupied with more important issues, like building giant golden statues of themselves, creating national holidays dedicated to them, and even banning dogs from cities because they smell bad. That is not a joke, I'm being serious. Take a look at the GDP per capita of the nations. In your foolish ignorance, you might assume that while 3 of the nations indeed are extremely poor, Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan seem to be doing quite well economically. But exactly like your dad did 9 months before you were born, you made a mistake. While obviously the economies of the 2 nations have grown significantly, the benefits haven't been distributed equally all across the economy. While rich oligarchs bought golden toilet seats and exotic animals for their private zoos, the poor can barely afford to feed themselves. And unfortunately, the accumulation of all those issues have created an environment where creating a company or getting a good career without generously tipping some hard-working politicians is almost impossible. Aside from that, securing funding for a startup is almost unreasonably difficult because the banking system is very fragile, and no foreign investor that doesn't suffer from chronic brain damage would ever invest in Central Asia. So obviously the most educated and hard-working individuals choose to start their companies overseas, which means that no good-paying careers exist in the nation. Although all the jokes about Borat and golden toilets are quite funny, I want to emphasize that reality is very depressing. Millions upon millions of Central Asians suffer needlessly on a daily basis. But historically, this region used to be one of the richest in the world, being home to the Silk Road, which connected Europe with East Asia. And if you don't know a lot about history, silk in the ancient world was something like Bitcoin is nowadays. And the reputation of being a great middleman continues even to this day. They have good relationships with almost every country in the world, obviously excluding the fact each nation in Central Asia hates every other nation in Central Asia with a passion, which effectively means they can export raw materials to both rich and developed Europe, but also to the rising economic giants in East Asia, particularly China. Aside from that, it's also home to beautiful cultures and majestic landscapes that attract millions of tourists on a yearly basis. But by far and away, their population explosion is the most important factor. For most of history, due to having more people, Russia has always been bullying Central Asia. But as they say, the turns have table. Since 1950, the Central Asian population grew from 15 million to 85 million, and in the next few decades, it's bound to overshadow Russia's population, which will significantly shift the balance of power in the region. But although the future looks bright, we still have to ask ourselves, why aren't they rich right now? And the answer, aside from systematic corruption and getting bullied more than a nerd in an 80s movie, is the resource curse. While finding oil and mineral deposits might be beneficial for an economy, more often than not it leads to an economic disaster. Just ask Venezuela, and there are 2 primary reasons for that. Firstly, it's incredibly easy to corrupt. Once again, just ask Venezuela. And secondly, if a nation is very good at exporting raw materials, that usually artificially raises the price of the nation's currency, which means other exports become much less competitive on the global market. Central Asia is basically exactly like you, a massive failure. But unlike you, the region still has immense potential for growth, improving the standards of living for its people, and maybe even making its parents proud for once. Anyway, subscribe to the channel.